Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll briefly talk about new historicism, especially with relation to Michel Foucault's work. Now, someone had posed a question to me through a message about what is it that Foucault contributes to new historicism. So if you did a basic research on American New Historicism, you will automatically find a lot of materials that would tell you that a lot of what comes out as what is called New Historicism is dependent upon Foucault's work. So first, what are the main distinctions between traditional historicism and new historicism? Now, traditional historicism looked at history as a sort of grand narratives of history as facts, right? As factual materials that could be understood and that were transparent, right? What Foucault adds to that is a completely different way of looking at history. And my thoughts, what I'm expressing here, are not related to one particular work of Foucault, but it's like Foucault's oeuvre. So that's why I can't go here and read this. So in order to understand how Foucault reconfigures how history ought to be studied, taught, and thought about, depends on some of the concepts that he develops, right? His idea of the episteme, his idea of the discourse, and the congruence of knowledge and power in the process of knowledge making. So in order to find any given episteme in any given time, if you read Foucault's works, any of his works, what does he do? He goes to the archive. He goes and collects all the materials published about sexuality, published about disciplinarity, about sentencing people, about medicine, and by a thorough reading of that, right, he figures out this was the episteme, this was the way of looking at the truth during this time. Now that's one aspect of Foucault's work that figures prominently in New Historicism, because what New Historicism says is, okay, let's not just work the Elizabethan age, right, and then look at the works produced in there. But see, this is when this particular play of Shakespeare comes out, what exactly was happening within the theater scene, what was the politics of that time, what was the contemporary belief system, what were the power structures, and if we know that, we can then understand this play better. But here is another thing to keep in mind. Foucault's idea of history is not that history is natural. His idea of history is that history depends on texts. It also depends on what are the dominant texts at a given time, and the role of the historian then is not to just accept the dominant texts and their narratives, but to go and find what Foucault calls buried knowledges. Knowledges that might have not been very prominent at that time, but that had an impact on how things were thought. Now, this is what he calls the bruised knowledge and buried knowledge, and the purpose is to juxtapose that knowledge with the normative knowledge, the dominant knowledge, and see what comes across as truth. Now, that is a very crucial insight for new historicists, but also for those of us who do work about the periphery and the dominant groups, because the idea is to extract from history the hidden narratives, the narratives that were sidelined, that weren't part of the dominant discourse, and then complicate the idea of a generalized large history. So new historicists then, of course, do that as well. Sometimes they go overboard, like they will find one little text and then based on that text they will, reinterpret certain literary texts. But the idea is for whatever buried knowledge that you discover, you read a given text in history from that perspective, to lend more meanings to it, but also to suggest that there was a parallel discourse going on which has been silenced. Now, that's what a lot of feminist works do, that's what a lot of post-colonial works do. That instead of looking at history from a dominant Eurocentric perspective, let's see what the native people themselves were writing in response to the powers of colonialism, and then look at history from that point of view. Within the post-colonial nation states, the Subaltern Studies Project is a project aimed at complicating the idea of official history of India, complicating it with the histories by retrieval and rearticulation, histories that have been silenced, that don't form part of the national narrative. So Foucault's role is important in New Historicism in this view of history as discursive. History is produced by those who produce knowledge, and it's appropriated by the dominant power. So power and knowledge come together to normalize a certain given history, and in New Historicism, we point to that, and then we try to see what other alternatives are available. What other alternative episteme could have been available? Way of looking at things, way of understanding the things, right? So that's Foucault's influence. Then also Foucault's influence on New Historicism, of course, is about power, his theorization of power, right? Power for Foucault is not hierarchical, it's not top-down, right? It's everywhere. It spreads like the arteries and capillaries, right? So, and it spreads through knowledge, through discourse. But the important thing is that it also produces its own resistances. Accounting for those resistances is important as a new historicist. Now, regardless of my brief explanation, one thing, of course, is clear, that Foucault's work has a strong impact on New Historicism. And then people have gone and done different things with it. I mean, if you read Stephen Greenblatt, who's considered, the father of New Historicism, he focuses on different things. But if you read his book, Will in the World, I think, on William Shakespeare, there his kind of historicism becomes highly speculative, because he extrapolates from little knowledge that he can gain from textual resources, and then he starts assuming things about Shakespeare. I don't know, it probably works in Renaissance studies, but one big critique of New Historicism is that they find a little thing here and there and then build on it a whole edifice of scholarship. You can read those things and find out for yourself. But if you are strictly going by Foucault, the idea is to find out discourses that did exist, that had an impact, but that are not acknowledged. For example, History of Sexuality, Volume 1, when he talks about the repressive hypothesis, right? The general idea about Victorian England is that sexuality was repressed, right? But what Foucault goes and finds is that right when, about this time period where we are saying sexuality was repressed, so much was being written about sexuality. But it was written in the language of policing sexuality, or medical journals, or, So what he ends up proving is that there existed a discourse that was about sexuality, not about sex, right? But that means that conversations about sexuality were not repressed, were not talked about, right? But he discovers a whole episteme and not just one book hidden somewhere, right? Another way of finding this a new historicist mode would be, what the feminists have done, the American feminists, and they would tell you that when Hawthorne and others were great authors during their time, right? But who was outselling them? 4 or 5 female authors, right? But they've been silenced over the production of American literary canon, so the feminists go and recover those. Not simply because these texts lay hidden in history, but they were prominent at a given time. People were reading them, right? Bringing that up would be a project of new historicism in that Foucauldian sense. So overall, I mean, of course, I can't cover everything. The idea is that Foucault does have a huge impact on how new historicism develops. He was here in California when new historicism was becoming prominent. His way of looking at history as an outcome of discourses and not just objective fact, right, still impacts new historicism, but also other fields of literary scholarship. So the important thing is that after you have read your Foucault and understood him, any idea of a natural history on a natural progression kind of becomes unsustainable, because that natural progression of history is done because of power and knowledge and prestige of those who produce knowledge, and by suggesting that there is this one march of history to the present. There are complicating histories that have been silenced, not talked about, not written about. So a new historicist project then becomes in locating those and finding those out and articulating them. So for example, in my work, years ago I discovered the work of Maulana Mumtaz Ali, right? In 1898 he published a book, Hukuk-e-Niswa, Rights of Women, in which he refuted all major religious claims about superiority of men. Now, when he published the book, when he articulated his opinions, his work became crucial towards the rise of Muslim women's education in India, right? He also published a journal which was called Talim-e-Niswa, right? So his work had huge impact during his time. But if you go and talk to traditional Muslim scholars in Pakistan, they don't even mention his name. They don't even account for his work. And the reason they don't account for his work is because his argument already has answered their conservative view of women's role in society. So instead of challenging him, they have silenced his work, right? So a work of retrieval then would be retrieving Maulana Mumtaz Ali's work, right? And tracing its impact during its own time. That would be new historicist. And then taking that impact and rereading what is happening today in Pakistan or India. So that would be sort of a new historicist project in terms of history. Another good example would be Deepesh Chakrabarty's book, Provincializing Europe, because that's exactly what he's doing, right? He's trying to suggest that history is not this one monolithic, simple narrative from past to present, that it is motivated, there is power and knowledge constituencies behind it that decide what we view as normal history. And the idea is to provincialize it, to infuse it with the knowledges of what used to be the periphery. So these are some of my thoughts on, generally speaking, Foucault's influence on new historicism. And in order to understand it clearly, you'll have to read up and develop an understanding of Foucault's, understanding of the episteme, the discourse, how power and knowledge come together, how texts and views about them get normalized, get perpetuated, become the norm, and how they sidelined anything else, a competing episteme or a competing discourse that was happening at that point in history when a certain literary text was produced. And if you can juxtapose that against the mainstream discourse or a mainstream way of looking at it, then in a way you are doing new historicism in that Foucauldian sense. I hope this was useful to you. These are just my views, tentative as they are. I do encourage you to read Foucault, read him carefully, and then of course form your own opinions. This video or this conversation is not exhaustive. It is not, a deeply presented truth of Foucault. It's just my thoughts, and that's how it should be taken. And I wish you a happy reading of Foucault and then a deeper understanding of Foucault and New Historicism. That's all. Please stay safe, take care of each other, be generous, and I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, peace and love.